and growing authoritarianism is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not a crisis that can be reduced to the United States southern border, as we've heard in recent weeks in our media, unfortunately. It has been increasingly met by scapegoating of those attempting to find safety and survival amid rising populist and nativist movements in countries across Europe and much of the West. Borders are being tightened, compounding the already dire humanitarian and political dimensions of this crisis. To understand why there is a migration crisis and what could possibly and should be done about it, we called on several experts who will offer their insights and expertise on what is among the central issues of our time. Our speakers include Susan Fratzke, Senior Policy Analyst with Migration Policy Institute's International Program, Andrew Rosenberg, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida and author of the book Undesirable Immigrants: Why Racism Persists in International Migration. Amali Tower, founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. Hossein Ajazi, policy analyst with the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. We ask, please, speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. Okay, so we are ready, so let's go. Susan, welcome, and please go ahead.
Hi, Pilar. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be with you today and to discuss what is happening, not just at the U.S. southern border, but also globally. As Pilar mentioned, I focus on global refugee and protection issues, and I've particularly done a lot of work looking at what's happened in Europe and around the European migration crisis several years ago and in that region. And I wanted to share just three main points around what is happening globally that I think will be important to bear in mind for the remainder of our conversation today. The first is, as Pilar mentioned, and as we know coming into this conversation, what we're seeing on the U.S. southern border is not a phenomenon that's restricted to the U.S. or to Mexico or even to this hemisphere. This is something that's happening in other parts of the world as well. The issue of people being driven from their homes for various reasons and needing to seek protection of different forms in other countries. I'm always hesitant to say that what we're seeing worldwide right now is something that's unprecedented or has never happened before in history, because I think that's very difficult to actually prove. But we can say that within the last 100 years, what we're seeing in terms of the numbers of people on the move and the numbers of people who are moving, I should say, also in ways that are very unpredictable and being forced to move in ways that are outside of normal legal migration pathways is really unprecedented for what we've seen in the last 100 years. And I wanted to just give a couple of examples of what we're seeing in other parts of the world. If we look specifically at Europe, which also gets a lot of attention in the global media, Europe alone received nearly 1 million asylum applications last year in 2022, mostly from individuals from Syria, Afghanistan, Turkey, Venezuela, Colombia, and that's on top of having received more than 4 million Ukrainians who had been displaced into Europe in 2022 alone, as well as migrants and refugees who've come in previous years to Europe, as well as back in 2015, 2016, the last time the European migration crisis was in the news. If we look at Europe's immediate neighborhood, so Turkey and the Middle East, a region that hosts a lot of refugees and migrants on its own, but also sees a lot of people transiting through en route to Europe. Turkey alone is hosting between 4 and 6 million refugees and asylum seekers, mostly from Syria, but also from Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. If we look at Africa, another region that's been in the news lately, just in the last month in response to the Syrian conflict in Syria that broke out in mid-April, more than 200,000 people have been displaced outside of Sudan by fighting just in the last month alone, on top of 800,000 people who had already been displaced from Sudan by fighting in the last decade. And that comes on top of refugee situations in Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and elsewhere in the continent. And then if we turn back closer to home, I think it's worth looking at what's happening elsewhere in our own region as well. If we turn to just the situation in Venezuela, more than 7 million Venezuelans have had to leave their home country in the last decade. Most of them have traveled to Colombia or Peru, but also onward to the US, Ecuador, Chile, Spain, and Brazil. And that's not even touching on what's been happening in Asia. So again, truly something that's touched a lot of world regions. But I think it's also worth noting that the displacement that we're seeing is not just happening globally. This isn't just the result of conflicts and displacement situations spread across the world, but also the movements are increasingly global. People are not just moving to a country right across the border to a neighboring country, or even one or two countries further on, but truly when displacement happens, people are seeking refuge really across the world. If we look at just North America, and what's been happening in the US and Mexico, the movements that we're seeing and people who are moving across the region to look for safety are not just Central Americans or even individuals from Mexico, as we saw a decade ago, but people who are seeking safety from countries in South America and really all over the world. If we look at UNHCR data from April, UNHCR had estimated that more than 1,300 people per day were crossing Panama en route to Mexico and eventually the US. And as of this winter, nearly 2/3 of the individuals who were apprehended crossing the US-Mexico border were from countries other than Mexico and Central America. Many of these are South American countries, Colombia, Venezuela, or in the Caribbean, so Haiti. But there are also a lot of people traveling through Mexico to the U.S. southern border from China, India, Russia, or even Afghans. Brazil has been offering a humanitarian visa to Afghans, and there have been many cases of individuals traveling from Afghanistan to Brazil and then onward through the Darien and Mexico to the US. And that's not a phenomenon, again, that's limited to the US southern border. Displacement is really happening in global ways elsewhere as well. I mentioned the...
Slow down a bit for interruption.
Sorry. So I mentioned the numbers of displacement in Europe. If we look at Spain alone, Colombians and Venezuelans were two of the largest nationalities seeking asylum in Spain in the last couple of years. So very briefly, what's driving this? I think it's important to recognize that it's really a complex mix of factors that layer on top of each other. We often think of political repression and persecution, and that's, of course, one of the main factors that's been driving people to leave places like Afghanistan or Nicaragua, or populations like the Rohingya in Bangladesh, who are being persecuted for their ethnic identity and religious beliefs. There are also situations of generalized violence and fighting and conflict that are causing people to move, like in Sudan or in Ukraine. But there are also economic factors and environmental factors that are layered on top of this. In the last several years, a number of different economies have experienced economic difficulties in the post-COVID period that have led to inflation and labor market difficulties that are causing people to leave. If we look at the case of Haitians, for example, who have come to the United States, many of them were living in Brazil or Colombia for years and have now moved onward and left for the United States. And that's the case for other groups. You see other groups of people who were displaced or moved for one reason to another country and now have had to leave again because of economics or other factors. Syrians in Lebanon is another example. The Lebanese economy has been in extreme difficulty for the last several years. Many Syrians had gone initially to Lebanon because it's right across the border from Syria, and now are having to move onward. And of course, there's also climate factors on top of this. every country in the world, of course, is being affected by climate change, but refugees often are living in or hosted in some of the most precarious places within a country. A good example is the Rohingya in Bangladesh, who live in a coastal area that's very vulnerable to flooding during monsoons and heavy rains. And are then experiencing the effects of sea level rise, unstable weather patterns in a way that, while it affects other, other populations in the area, is particularly affecting them because of where they live. So the final point that I wanted to make in terms of why we're seeing this now, what's happening. We have all of these drivers, the persecution, state-sponsored violence, generalized violence, economic factors. But as we heard at the beginning, there are also a lot of policy factors driving this. And of course, these trends are also driving their own policy responses that have effects. The first is the fact that there's a lack of legal pathways for people to move globally. There are very few opportunities for people to move for work unless they're at a very high skill level. So individuals who work in skilled or unskilled trades as laborers have very few opportunities to move legally and look for work elsewhere. Opportunities to move for family reunification, to reunify with your family elsewhere, are also very limited, very restricted to traditional nuclear family definitions, and have very long wait times. And the point that I think has been most important for my work and the issues that I'm studying is the fact that there are very few opportunities to actually travel legally to seek asylum or seek protection. If someone is at risk in their home country or elsewhere, often the only way to actually seek protection is to leave through using a smuggler, using forged travel documents, something like that. That's very unsafe because it's very difficult to get a legal visa or some other way to move. And this creates other challenges because states and governments have been very bad at dealing with crises, humanitarian crises at their borders. The policy frameworks that they use to respond are very outdated. It's been very challenging to actually manage all of the logistics of humanitarian situations at borders, and there are really very few states that have managed to do this well to meet the humanitarian needs or protection needs of people who are arriving. And that's really contributed to the challenges that we've seen in sort of these scenes of chaos, and also some of the political responses as well. So I'll leave it there and hand over to the other panelists.
Okay, Susan, thank you. There is a question. Sunita, you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Pilar. Susan, I wanted to ask you to characterize migrants. What do they actually look like? We in the media tend to focus on, the family with the child, right? Because that's a photo-worthy moment. But is that the characteristic of most migrants? Are there entire families, or is it mostly young men? And are countries more amenable to entire families who are seeking asylum?
It's a really good question. So it's hard to make a broad characterization because it really depends on which area of the world you're looking at. If you look at, for example, Ukrainians who have fled into Europe, those are mostly women and children and families because the men have been conscripted into the Ukrainian military. But if you look at the migrants and refugees who have been coming to Europe across the central Mediterranean, a lot of those are young single men who are traveling and trying to work and send money home or get status and then bring the rest of their family because it's a very dangerous trip. So it really depends on the region. But yes, I would say generally countries have been more accepting of taking families and children and women than they have men. That's also the case in refugee resettlement programs. Countries are much more willing to take women and children, and it's something that I've found very concerning for a long time because men can actually be at risk too. They can be at risk of forced conscription. They can be at risk of violence by gangs, these other things. But no, it's true that often countries are much more willing to take women and children.
Okay, and I think Sandy was messaging me something. Are women half of the global? So she said women form half of the global migration in 2010. Is that still the case? Women and children?
So, I mean, children are quite a large proportion of the global refugee population. I think the numbers that I've seen before are something like 40%. I don't have the latest information, the latest data in front of me, but it does vary quite a bit population to population who is actually moving where.
Okay, thank you, Susan. We have 3 more speakers, so I'm going to move on. Please stay with us so we can have more of a conversation. And so we move on to Andrew Rosenberg. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. Speaking slowly is probably the thing I'm worst at in the entire world. And so I'm gonna absolutely do my best. So please let me know if I mess up, but I'm just throwing that out there. So I was really excited to hear about this panel because it combined, I think, several really important things that I've been thinking a lot about in my work. The first is obviously global migration and the so-called global migration crisis. The second is the role of, we'll call it, I guess, populism and anti-immigrant prejudice. And the final is the connection between those first 2 things and the ongoing and increasingly worsening climate crisis. And so I'm going to, I guess, make 3 points that will try to sort of thread these things together. That's based on my book as well as some of my ongoing work. Now, as an academic international relations scholar, I think about these issues from a very sort of broad, global, and historical perspective. And so that's how I'm going to lay out my thinking about where we are and where we might be going. So the first point is when we think about why the migration crisis exists the way it does in the contemporary international system, I think we need to think historically about where that crisis comes from. And when I say where that crisis comes from, that means why the movement of people that Susan described a few minutes ago is characterized, particularly in Western countries, as a crisis. And so I like to think historically about what causes the factors within states for those, I guess, ideologies to proliferate. And one way of thinking about it is to think about how since the 2008 global financial crisis, we've seen inequality and precarity increase tremendously within both the global North and the global South. But within the global North in particular, this rising inequality and precarity is one stated cause of the rise of right-wing populism and the scapegoating of migrants from throughout the world. And I think it's important to realize that this inequality and this sort of trauma has generated real precarity amongst voters and citizens of countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and like other countries. And what this does is provide an opening for enterprising politicians who are motivated to be elected and to amass power. But this sort of large economic shock that had real effects and real consequences provides this opening. And so that's one way I like to think, it's not very historically, at least in this case, but thinking about the roots of the politics that we see every day if we turn on the television. So that leads to the further question, why do we see the scapegoating of migrants in particular, and migrants from certain parts of the world as well, particularly those from the global South? And in my book, I go at length, I go to great lengths to talk about where this, I call it racism or racial prejudice comes from. And I think a lot of people, in the popular press, in the media, in the academy, have done a really great job at characterizing the sort of explicit prejudice that exists vis-a-vis migrants. But I like to think about the historical roots of that prejudice. Because I think if you go outside and you talk to, I don't know, 5 or 10 random people that you meet, and maybe those people, hold anti-immigrant or anti-migrant sentiments, I would wager that very few of them would say that they don't want migrants from the global South to come to their country, to come to the United States because of explicitly racist or explicitly prejudiced reasons. They would say that they have principled objections to those migrants on supposedly objective or race-blind grounds. But my argument is that those objective grounds are still correlated with race because of the harm that Western countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and other European countries did to the global South over the course of the last several centuries. So basically, Western countries created the conditions of poverty, violence, precarity that they now dismiss as objective reasons to be against migrants in the modern day. And so I think it's quite important to reveal the explicit racism and the explicit prejudice that characterizes, anti-migrant attitudes today. But I think it's really important to think about also the historical antecedents of that, I think, more pernicious, even call it colorblind prejudice or colorblind discrimination that I think would represent maybe not a majority, but maybe a plurality of anti-immigrant sentiments. So the final thing I want to talk about is, I want to raise the question, what does this have to do with climate change? What does this have to do with the climate crisis? And I'm interested in what my colleagues on the panel have to say about this as well, particularly those who are experts in this area. But this is just how I've been thinking about it. So as we've already heard, climate change will likely, it will affect everybody, but at least in our current stage, it is disproportionately affecting the global South. Therefore, a majority, or again, at least a plurality of climate migrants will be from the global South, will be from these precarious places. Now, given the conditions of prejudice, inequality, and resentment in the global North that I just described a few minutes ago, I think it's unlikely that the West will have the political will to help. And in fact, I think this sort of dovetails a lot with what Susan was talking about. And so what this is going to do, again, as Susan described, what this is going to do and what this is doing is locking global South climate migrants out of the global North and creating sort of a climate fortress global North. And therefore the responsibility to protect and assist these climate migrants will disproportionately fall on the global South. And what we also know is that within the global South, not just climate migration, but migration in general, leads to a variety of types of conflict in a variety of countries due to competition, perceived or real, over resources, which also generates anti-migrant antipathy. And so this this conflict and precarity will further exacerbate those prejudiced perceptions of the global South that's held by the global North that, again, I talked about a few minutes ago, which will therefore make the problem even worse that I described and laid out, in my first book. And so what I think we all need to think about is we can't consider any of these crises in isolation. Some people have been using the word polycrisis to describe the importance of the interdependence or interconnection between and among all of these crises. And also, what I want to draw our attention to is the role of history and the role of prejudice in perpetuating each of those crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Drew. That was very informative. And I think one question that is pending in the chat is very relevant for you, because this is, I think, the question that has been asked every time there is, at every moment in our history when we have immigrants. What is the effect on the countries that receive the immigrants? What does history, and I made your question, Henrietta, sorry about that. What does history tell us about this effect? Because people are always fearful about migrants coming in, but I think history tells us those fears are exaggerated, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both the question and your response to the question kind of encapsulate a lot of what I've been thinking about on this topic in general. I think a lot of economists and political scientists for many years have shown that the effect is, if not an unqualified positive, a nearly unqualified positive, particularly when it comes to the effect on the local labor market, economic growth, the welfare state, and so on. These are positive effects, but the fact that this conventional wisdom persists among the public that is so easy to mobilize, maybe based on fear, maybe based on prejudice. That's one of, I think, the real challenges and one of my personal fears, because it's not obvious to me, given all of the evidence that we have of these positive effects, how we can describe to the public at large these truths in a way that will actually be able to break down pre-existing views or other political factors that may be driving those views and so on. That's why I know that's not a great answer, but that's how I've been thinking about it, because it's a difficult problem. Yes,
indeed. Okay, we're going to move on. And please stay around, because we'll have more conversation. So I'm going to invite Amali Tower. I know you've been in close contact with refugees. You've visited camps. You have a very close view of this issue. What can you share with us, and in particular the climate issue as a push factor?
Yes, thank you so much, Pilar. Really an honor to be here, and it's especially nice going after Drew, because I fully agree with what you've been saying about race and the role of race and racism. I will, as Pilar sort of indicated, I've been asked to give you more of a perspective of how climate is intersecting in terms of displacement and forced migration, and also specifically what's happening at the US southern border with, I'm sure a lot of you as journalists have been hearing about Title 42. What is that? How does that factor in? Oh, I apologize if any of you are hearing a drill above me. I'm in New York City. This is typical, but okay, here I go. So let me just kind of begin by saying there is absolutely no doubt that climate change is driving global displacement. Let me also make the time. Okay, so today over 100 million people are displaced across borders, or across the world, we'll say, due to conflict, crises, increasingly climate change as well. About 86% of refugees today are hosted in the global south. That 100 million does not mean everyone's a refugee. Only about somewhere between 26 and 30 million. We don't have the exact stats for this year yet, because Ukraine is a major game changer. Enjoy the legal status of refugee. So, we don't have time to go into all of it. So just imagine then 30 minus 100 million. Okay, who are those other people? Asylum seekers, forced migrants, internally displaced person. And where does climate rank in that? Well, we don't really know. On average, about 23 million people are displaced each year by climate change and weather-related events. And that happens mostly internally within people's own countries. What we know in terms of climate change displacement is that persons, like I said, are displaced within their own countries, but we don't know about cross-border displacements. And international organizations like the UN Refugee Agency and the UN Organization on International Organization on Migration, which is now also part of the UN, have not provided an assessment of how many it can be. So much so that, recently the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, who had a report just come out about how do we protect people in climate displacement contexts across borders, a report that, I weighed in on, and it was really, nice to have our work cited in that. But for example, EN5, the Special Rapporteur, has expressed concern then that these very agencies, UNHCR and IOM, there might be an unwillingness to gauge the possible number as well. And remember that all of our UN agencies are the result of UN member state-led initiatives, right? So there's a whole lot of politics at play here as well, in terms of like what we want to know and what we don't necessarily have political will to know. UNHCR has suggested, though, that as many as 80 to 90% of refugees could be coming from climate change vulnerable countries. And about 70% of IDPs, internally displaced persons, are also coming from climate vulnerable countries. Now, in some years, it's much higher. That 23 million in 2020 rose up to 30.7 million people, which actually was 3 times more the displacement than conflict. So you can see how climate is a major driver these days. And this is in context where we still don't even have an accurate grasp on exactly how climate is driving things. The actual number of people displaced then across international borders, as I said, is not well known. It's estimated that, it could be hundreds of thousands annually. This is per the Special Rapporteur. In 2015, for example, to give you an example, 50 countries had experienced people crossing into their countries due to disasters. Now, the people crossing international borders due to climate change are generally not defined under the 1951 Refugee Convention as refugees because they don't fit the definition, which I'll skip over that definition for sake of time right now. Here in the US, there has been a growing number of migrants coming to the US border seeking asylum. There has also been a shift in where people are coming from. Traditionally, what's been more has been Mexico. We've seen a major uptick and change in geography as well to Central America. Now, in the dry corridor region of Central America, which is the economic backbone of all Central American countries, and I believe is well over like a third anyway of these countries' geography. Now, in particular, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In 2016, over 3.5 million people needed humanitarian assistance due to an extended drought. World Food Program noted that starting in about 2014, El Nino drought conditions led to a significant increase in irregular migration. This is like a more polite UN way of saying illegal. It led to this irregular migration to the United States. Now, a lot of these migrants do tend to be young people, but that has shifted since 2014. In 2020, 2 severe hurricanes, Eta and Iota, also caused significant damage to infrastructure. Central America has always ranked very high in the disaster risk indices, by the way, as being vulnerable to climate change effects. Now, we know from a Latin American civil society organizations, for example, that some people have been very reluctant to identify as being climate displaced, knowing fully well the legal limitations. And they've even said that they exaggerated the violence and other situations that are also concurrently ongoing in Central America to identify as those were their problems and drivers so they could seek legal protection. Now, again, because we're not centrally asking the question, were you displaced by climate change, or was climate a factor, or something like that, we don't know. And you can see how in some certain circumstances, you're even hearing migrants change, right, what their drivers are. In my experience, refugees and forced migrants are the most knowledgeable about the legal dimensions and In fact, that's what led to me founding the organization. It was refugees themselves who were disclosing to me how much climate change and environmental degradation were a factor. So anyway, now from my own work at the US border, I have met people who were forced to leave purely because of climate change related events and the particular risks they faced. Could have found legal protection under the Refugee Convention. However, Title 42, instituted by the US government since Trump era, barred them from even entering the country, let alone seeking asylum. Now, the countries that are historically the most vulnerable for the climate crisis, as Drew said, are global north countries. But would you believe that they spend more money securing their borders to keep migrants out than they do on tackling the crisis that forces people from their homes in the first place? Their spending, for example, these are 7 of the historic and today as well highest emitters from the global north spend. Their ratio of spending is more than 2 to 1 more on border security than it is on climate finance. So for those 7 countries, you could say that border security is their climate policy. It wouldn't be hard to make that statement. The US is the world's largest historic emitter, contributing about 21.5% of carbon emissions, although they only comprise 4.5% of the global population. The US has now lifted Title 42 as of this month, and the government and news accounts portray this as like, okay, so migrants are now going to flood the border seeking asylum. In practice, though, many of my colleagues are telling me that the vast majority of people are still waiting in squalid camps across the borders of Texas and California and Mexico, denied an opportunity to even enter. The US government has instituted an app that you can access on your phone, which I saw a question in the chat about it as well, by which migrants and asylum seekers can apply to gain entry. But it's deeply problematic to accessing, and as well, it's deeply discriminatory towards Black and even brown people because it's based on facial recognition software. So that's another thing that advocates have to deal with. Now, the border security complex is made up of surveillance, drones, facial recognition, biometric technologies that greatly undermine basic human rights, for example, like in privacy. But it also undermines the right to migrate and the right to seek asylum, 2 very distinct rights, by the way. Lifting Title 42 has come with instituting an asylum ban, by which migrants that do not seek asylum in a country they pass on their way to the United States could be denied the right to seek asylum in the US. Now, this is completely in violation of both US law and international law, and yet it is happening. I believe in the US, and Susan would know this better, I think this is Section 8 in the Immigration Act that is now Title 42 is lifting, which is this public health, very arcane public health law that's been in place since COVID-19. And now you have this asylum ban that's sort of like snuck back in and has been used in the US for decades. It's a very old strategy. And as you heard Susan talk about Europe, it's a global strategy that the richest and the most culpable countries in the world for crises, including the climate crisis, use to keep the most vulnerable, marginalized people who are in the global south primarily, but also global north actors, in a domestic way, are also penalized and marginalized. And there's extremely a racism component in all of this. Now, the US is moving towards setting up processing centers in Central America as a measure to slow down the arrivals at the border. This is possibly in line with recommendations that even we at Climate Refugees have made to the White House when the president so that would have been 2021, I guess, commissioned a government report to look at climate change-driven migration and policies and solutions for the protection of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, et cetera, in climate change contexts. Now, progress on the many recommendations that we made and other civil society actors made and the conversations we had with the US government actors were all adopted in a White House report on climate-driven migration and displacement. And it has, the work and implementation on that has mainly stalled because of Ukraine, because of Afghanistan, because of probably also a lack of political will, but this could be what I mentioned about the new processing centers in Central America could be a sign of movement. It's worth noting, though, that the report's work sits with a special task force in the National Security Council, which I think does indicate to all of us where the priority areas are and where this as a priority might sit. I think I might be at time, so I'm going to leave it there. I hope I spoke slow enough. If not, I'm happy to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, if you hadn't, I would have heard about it from the interpreters. There's a question by Peter White in the chat. Can climate refugees claim asylum in the US? I can't hear you.
They cannot, as it stands right now. There is legislation that has been put forth from Representative Nydia Velasquez, Senator Ed Markey. This will be, I think, the second or third time that they might try to admit it, but it has stalled in committees. To widen the Refugee Act of 1980 to allow the admission of climate displaced persons. Besides the US, I will say that in October 2021, I think it is, UNHCR did finally provide some legal guidance that, for brevity, I'll just say, does show you that there are at least two contexts in which climate displaced people across borders may find a nexus ground for the 1951 Refugee Convention, which says you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, left your country, and are seeking asylum on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. I myself have advocated with the special rapporteur that there might be also context to look at how social group, in certain frontline communities, countries even, might actually be a very big group of people.
Thank you, Amali. Let's welcome our final speaker, Hossein. Please go ahead. I don't want you to be short on time.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Sunita and Sandy, for the invitation and for hosting this conversation. I'm so glad to be here with my co-panelists. I've long appreciated your work, and it's so nice to share this space with you all in this particular conversation, and really appreciating how complementary our contributions are. So like we're here to discuss, right, faced with increasing climate crisis impacts of short and long-term natural disasters, people are forced to move. This is within their countries, which actually makes up the bulk of recorded climate-induced displacement, and across countries, that is internationally. So in light of this fact and the fact that the crisis is worsening, I think three key questions emerge that we're all grappling with and speaking to. So the first is, how possible is it for climate-induced displaced people to move, and how supported are they during the resettlement process? My co-panelists are speaking directly to this question. And one thing I'll reiterate in this regard that Amali just spoke to is, across international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law, and other bodies of law, protections for climate-induced displaced persons forced to cross international borders are limited, piecemeal, not legally binding. I mean, it feels important to name it explicitly that climate refugee is not actually a legal category, a legally protected category. And I think we might all agree that it should be, right? Or certainly that there would be benefits in it becoming so. And the second question here, and I think I appreciate, Susan, how you mentioned this early on, was how media attention has generally focused on Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, and other parts of the global north, opening or closing their borders to climate-induced displaced persons from across the global south, from Africa, Asia, South and Central America, and elsewhere. Yet far less attention has been paid to the structural causes of such displacement and the uneven experience of precarity to the climate crisis itself. That is, we need to ask, why are people from across the global south so profoundly and disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis such that they're forced to move, whether internally or internationally? And so with that, a third question necessarily emerges, and that's, how are peoples from across the global south actually building resilience to the climate crisis, such that countries and communities alike can withstand the intensifying impacts of the climate crisis? And with that, what actual demands do they have from the international community towards such ends, right? And so that's actually the note that I'm going to end on is what sort of movement demands can we center as we touch on this topic. So to the first question, or I suppose this is the second question, that the one that I'm focusing on is why the global South is being hit especially hard, right? That's an important one. And here I'm getting to some of those historical antecedents that Drew named, right, and their legacies today. So a clear answer in this regard is how the global North, through centuries of colonialism and enslavement and wealth and natural resource extraction, has severely impoverished the global South. Right? So vast wealth, resource, and infrastructure inequality between the global South and global North has hindered social, political, economic, and environmental resilience in the global South in a host of ways. So this is resilience to economic shocks, to environmental degradation, to political conflict, to social conflict, and so on, right? So here I'm going to focus on the past 50 years or so, right? So after this kind of era of decolonization in the mid 20th century took shape, because I think this is a way to identify some of those historical legacies and how they're kind of embedded within our institutions and practices today. So again, in the past 50 years, even after the formal end of colonialism, the global North has maintained this inequality through things like for example, predatory lending to global South nations to supposedly help them develop, while imposing harsh debt repayment priorities and forcefully opening up global South markets to really powerful global North firms. So here we know kind of predatory lending, say in the US context or in our own national context, but of course this has happened internationally and in ways that have severely hindered the actual development of global South nations. And that this is all with the help of dominant international financial institutions like the International Monetary Funds and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. These international financial institutions have collectively forced countries across Africa, Asia, South and Central America to stick to things like agricultural production to the continued benefit of the global North. And here's where I'm the point that I'm going to make, right? Development happens along certain pathways and has been forced to take shape in certain ways in the global South. So these pro-global North policies, practices, and institutions have led to two outcomes across the formerly colonized countries of the global South that is immediately relevant to how we understand and are witnessing the climate crisis take shape. So first, these policies and practices led to sharp shrinkage in government funds for education, health, and infrastructure. That is, they've undermined the development of adequate infrastructure that might help communities actually cope with climate impacts, right? That might actually preclude people's need to move internally and across borders. Second, these types of predatory policies and practices have entrenched global North-South relations of dependency that have forced many, many global South countries into deriving a relatively large percentage of their GDP, upwards of 60% in some countries, from things like agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Right? And so why is this important? Right? These are industries. 60% of a country's GDP is dependent upon these industries. And these are industries that are by nature more vulnerable to a changing climate and intense weather. Right? So this is like the legacy of hundreds of years of the underdevelopment of the global South. And so as such, a large majority of the world's poor depends upon moderate weather patterns and seasonal changes for their livelihood. Right? Well, it will certainly be compromised further as the climate crisis worsens, and thus forcing many people to actually relocate when staying in place becomes untenable. Right? So the second question, or I suppose the third question, is how are global South countries actually building resilience to the climate crisis, and what are their demands from the international community in light of hundreds of years of wealth extraction and accumulation and dispossession, right? So here I'll actually refer to a recent survey that the Othering and Belonging Institute, the institute that I'm a part of, that we just conducted, we'd surveyed several dozen organizations, several dozen African climate, agri-food, and environmental organizations working across the 5 regions on the African continent. And we wanted to see essentially how they're building climate resilience, what terms they're using themselves, again, what demands they're making, ways that we, based at UC Berkeley and other global North institutions, can support such work, right? Without kind of imposing top-down ideas in that way. And so it's a relatively recent survey. So it ran from mid-February to late March, and we just published the findings last month. Yes, certainly, I'll share the survey link. So, so collectively from the survey, respondents shared that their work is focused on, above all, creating local and regional economies and local development trajectories that are sustainable and just, that aren't extractive and that don't require fossil fuels, right? And I want to emphasize the local and regional economies piece. Everything I've mentioned thus far has been economies geared toward the extraction of wealth and resources from these places, right? So with that, 2 things in particular were revealed, right? What these organizations, how they responded was quite revealing in this regard. So most respondents shared that their long-term strategy for doing this, for building local and sustainable economies that kind of build climate resilience, is by actually scaling up sustainable agriculture, such as agroecological methods and reduced petrochemical use. And so research has actually shown time and time again that agroecological food systems, that sustainable food systems, are actually far more resilient to climate impacts while supporting communities themselves, socially, politically, economically, and so on. So what these organizations said is essentially that food systems are actually a way to build climate resilience, that there's not something inherently dispossessive or exploitative about them, but rather an opportunity here. And second, what these organizations responded with is that when asked the question of, okay, what sort of demands do they have upon global North organizations, institutions, civil society, and so on, is that they responded that they needed essentially the global North's help to build capacity among African organizations, right? Namely through unrestricted funding and the amplification of the voices of African organizations, right? So here we have clear demands, right, of like the redistribution of wealth and resources, of the centering of certain voices over others. And third, these organizations responded that the global North and global North organizations and civil society must actually reduce the global North's exploitation of land, resources, and labor from the global South, right? So this isn't just a matter of supporting climate refugees once displacement actually occurs, right? But this means actually transforming the very conditions that force displacement itself. So ultimately, 2 sets of principles or practices really become clear. And this is the kind of note that I want to end on here. These principles or practices are clear in addressing the climate crisis and the crisis of climate-induced migration. Right? And the first is what's known as a just transition away from fossil fuels. So some of us might be familiar with this term, but essentially, it's what these organizations and many, many others, including organizations within the global South, communities within the global North, this is a sort of transnational and global movement, is of building local and regional economies and development trajectories that aren't reliant on fossil fuels, transitioning away from fossil fuels in ways that's actually just and that actually democratizes our economies, our political institutions, our economic institutions, and so on, in ways that meet all the needs of all community members. And so the second thing becomes clear in the ways that these organizations responded and that peoples have long demanded in light of centuries of colonial and capitalist exploitation and extraction, and that's of climate reparations, right? So we have just transitions on the one hand and climate reparations as a way of actually facilitating that as a necessary condition of a transition into a post-fossil fuel world, right? So, so I'll say this, right? In order to define climate reparations, that's substantial, historically informed compensation to former colonized and marginalized developing countries. And in large part, that means monetary compensation, debt cancellation, and the transformation of international financial institutions themselves, right? Some of those that are directly responsible for the conditions that we are seeing today. So these are key to addressing the climate crisis itself and to mitigating and preempting the crisis of climate-induced migration. So I'll end there just to give us time to address some questions that some folks may have. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hossein. Thank you so much. Well, we have time for one round, and I want to go to each one of you again. And I think Henrietta has been asking in the chat questions about, how can countries like the U.S. cope with this migration? What is the solution to this, et cetera, et cetera. These are the questions that are in the chat. I just want to make a point of going around and ask you, and also what is the opportunity here? Susan.
Hi. Yeah, very happy to come in quickly on that. I really appreciate the perspectives that my co-panelists have shared about sort of the underlying causes of the migration that we're seeing, both in terms of the legacy of policies and results of colonialism, as well as the effects of climate change as well. In terms of thinking about how countries can adapt, I think it's worth just briefly taking a step back and thinking about the distinction between sort of proximate causes of why people are moving and some of the underlying long-term trends. I think sometimes there's a risk if we think about things like climate and the what the effects of it will be on things like migration and migration trends, that we can end up in a very scary place, with the idea that climate is going to end up driving extremely large numbers of people to move across international borders. And as Amelie said, in fact, a lot of the movement that's happening is happening internally and is happening in terms of internal displacement. And when we talk about sort of migration results and the risk of large numbers of people moving, it can sometimes feed into some of these narratives like Andrew talked about, and sort of fear mongering around migration. So I just wanted to sort of flag that. And as we're thinking about, what's actually driving people to move, there's all these underlying factors, results of colonialism, results of climate change, these other things, but there are also proximate causes that come on top of that, like the economic downturn that a lot of countries have faced as a result of COVID-19, like military conflict in Ukraine, these sorts of things that are really sort of immediate factors. And those factors, I think, are important to understanding, how we adapt and how we cope, and sort of where we can expect to see immediate pressures coming in the more near term. And I would also say I really appreciated the point that was made about resilience in particular, and how, in addition to sort of thinking about the migration impacts of climate, we also should be thinking about resilience and how to build resilience, and how to also empower local communities, including refugee-led organizations and organizations that are really serving refugees and displaced individuals on the ground, to really build resilience, and thinking about that alongside things like dealing like the impact of migration itself.
Thank you, Susan. Andrew?
Yes, thanks. So just, I guess, very quickly, Henrietta and others have asked so many great questions. I want to point to one of her questions about how, mega corporations will lose money if their governments meet the demands, and they'll be less as influential and so on. And I think that's a really great point. And it actually, at least for me, makes me want to think harder, think more about resilience. That's why I also really like this discussion of resilience, because when I think about what global North countries can do to promote resilience in the global South, that actually makes me think a lot about the sort of uneven success that foreign aid has had, with all of its sort of pros and cons, thinking about ways that capitalism plus resilience equals, I don't know, but it's something that I've been wrestling with quite a lot, because I think this is really the key question, and I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Mali?
Yes, I think conceptually, we need to shift to understanding that what we're really talking about here, by and large, is forced displacement and forced migration. That implies there is a global responsibility. That responsibility is failing at every single level and at sectors, industries. We're failing to understand the intersectionality of drivers. And that is leading to, in the context of a lack of global cooperation and trust and empathy, that I think is just massively failing on a human and state level. Even when we talk about resilience, I see resilience in all the global South communities I work in, even in global North marginalized communities. Even that resilience is enforced upon communities who have no choice but to adapt in place or find maladaptive coping mechanisms. So that resilience isn't necessarily fostered or supported, and it's not, we shouldn't think of that resilience as purely positive. It's a bit of a pull up by your bootstraps kind of situations that again is being enforced disproportionately to marginalized people.
Thank you, Amali. Hossein, final words.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that my co-panelists have said, and reiterate Amali's point that it certainly would be pull oneself up by their bootstraps. And so this is why the demands upon corporations, global North corporations, or organizations, institutions, and so on is so necessary to center in this work, so that it's not a sort of sole endeavor or just kind of highlighted or valorized in a certain way that ignores the complex and intersecting making of this crisis itself. And again, yeah, just very much appreciative of this conversation and to be here with you all.
Thank you to all. It has been really illuminating. Sandy, can you please give your final words? You know, you always like saying something.
This was just a great discussion. To take the term polycrisis and try to understand what is really involved in global migration, climate change, authoritarian governments, populist, militaristic, white supremacists. You have each brought such insights into both the particularities and the generic nature of the many, many intersecting crises behind global migration. You've stimulated us and inspired us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.